Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Thank you. Welcome to The World Over Live. Why is it that every Lent I go to a fish fry and I get a bone stuck right here? What is that? Do you think there's a spiritual message in there somewhere? Well, Lent has surely arrived, unfortunately for some. The clergy sex abuse crisis was reignited this week in Philadelphia, with the largest suspension of priests accused of abuse in U.S. church history. Here to talk about these latest developments, as well as the new translation of the bishop's New American Bible, is Philip Lawler, author of the book The Faithful Departed and director of CatholicCulture.org. And with congressional hearings examining Islamic radicalization here in the U.S., we'll talk with the author of The Closing of the Muslim Mind, Robert Reilly, later in the program. You won't want to miss that segment. And if you'd like to add your voice to the show, and if you have a question, the number is 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. and internationally, 205-271-2980, or drop us an email. We're at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get started. Here's the brief news from the world over this week. This marked another week of deadly violence against Christians, starting in Egypt. Clashes broke out Tuesday night in Cairo when a Muslim mob attacked a group of Christian demonstrators. The Christians were protesting the recent burning of a Coptic church just outside of Cairo and what they view as discrimination by the new government. According to reports, an angry crowd of Muslims attacked the Christian protesters who were blocking a vital Cairo highway. The two sides then fought pitched battles for the next 4 hours. In the end, 13 were killed, at least 6 Christians and 5 Muslims. Another 140 were wounded. The Christians were laid to rest on Thursday. Those attending the funeral called the dead martyrs. Meanwhile, Egypt's Prime Minister Essam Sharaf met with Coptic Christians and promised to restore security and help rebuild the burned church. Protests continued throughout the week. The Christian protests started after a mob of 4,000 Muslims overran a Coptic church outside of Cairo this past weekend and set it ablaze. According to Vatican-affiliated Asia News, the mob then blocked the fire brigade from entering the town. A curfew was later imposed on the 12,000 Christians living there. The church's priest and 3 deacons are missing and feared dead, and the church is just a pile of smoldering rubble. The attack sprang from a romantic relationship between a Coptic man and a Muslim woman. Now follow me here. The father of the Muslim woman was killed by his cousin because he refused to slay his daughter to preserve the family's honor. In turn, the dead man's son avenged the death of his father by killing the cousin. The town's Muslims blamed both murders on the Christians. The torches came out thereafter. And in Ethiopia this past week, Muslim mobs totaling more than 1,000 set afire and razed 59 churches. This after Muslims accused a Christian of desecrating the Quran by tearing up a copy. Christians are denying the charge. 24 homes were also destroyed. 1 Christian was killed and 4,000 had been displaced for fear of further attacks. Police eventually arrested 130 suspects in those attacks. And Bishop Andrew Francis of Pakistan is calling upon the church to declare assassinated government minister Shahbaz Bhatti a martyr. Bhatti, a Catholic and the country's only Christian cabinet minister, was laid to rest this past week after being assassinated for his opposition to the nation's blasphemy law. Cardinal Jean-Louis Thuram, the Vatican leader of interreligious dialogue, agreed with Bishop Francis, saying that Bhatti died an authentic martyr. During his Angelus address on Sunday, Pope Benedict voiced his hope that Bhatti's moving sacrifice may arouse, quote, the courage and commitment to defend the religious freedom of all men, end quote. More about this latest round of jihadist violence later in the show. And in Philadelphia, Cardinal Justin Reilly on Tuesday placed 21 priests on administrative leave following a grand jury investigation which reported allegations of sexual abuse. The 2-year investigation announced last month has already resulted in criminal charges against 2 priests, a former priest, and a Catholic school teacher. The former Archdiocesan Vicar of Clergy, Monsignor William Lynn, was also charged with endangering the welfare of children by allowing dangerous priests to remain in positions with access to children. Donna Farrell, the Director of Communications for the Archdiocese, spoke to reporters about the suspensions.
Clearly, the grand jury report presented extremely serious concerns. From the very beginning, when the report was released on February 10th, the Cardinal has stated that he takes those concerns very seriously. He is demonstrating that with his actions today.
On Ash Wednesday, Cardinal Reilly asked a packed crowd at the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul for forgiveness of all of those whom we have offended in any way, adding, "We likewise beg God to bring about reconciliation and healing in our community." The priest's suspensions are temporary, pending further investigation. More about this in our next segment. And Pope Benedict's latest book on Jesus was released this week, just in time for Lent, entitled Jesus of Nazareth, Holy Week, From the Entrance into Jerusalem to the Resurrection. The book is a continuing reflection on the life of Jesus. It's one of 3 parts. The book has received praise from some unexpected quarters. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is among several Jewish leaders commending the Pope for explicitly exonerating Jews for the death of Jesus. Media have also taken note of the Pope's latest rejection of violence in the name of God. Although the Holy Father did not directly mention any particular faith, he wrote, "The cruel consequences of religiously motivated violence are only too evident to us all." The Pope's first Jesus of Nazareth was a bestseller with more than 1 million copies in print. Publishers, including Ignatius Press, expect equal success with this latest installment. And Irish media are reporting this week that Pope Benedict XVI will visit Ireland in 2012. The trip would coincide with the International Eucharistic Congress scheduled for Dublin in June of that year. The Holy Father is expected to celebrate an open-air Mass at a park, marking the conclusion of the Congress. He's also expected to visit Northern Ireland. That would be a first for a Roman pontiff. John Paul II visited Ireland in 1979, but a Northern Ireland visit was called off due to a provisional IRA violence taking place at the time. An official Vatican announcement is not expected until early next year. And the Knights of Columbus formally opened a new prosthetics laboratory in Port-au-Prince in Haiti last weekend. The Knights are working in partnership with the University of Miami's Project MediShare on a project called Helping Haiti's Children. The program provides prosthetic limbs to every Haitian child who underwent an amputation due to last year's tragic earthquake. The new lab is able to manufacture custom-fitted prosthetics using the latest technology. It'll employ Haitians now being trained to do the work. The program includes physical therapy for the amputees, as well as replacement prosthetics for the kids as they grow. For more information, visit the website of the Knights of Columbus at kfc.org. And what better way to celebrate Lent than by immersing yourself in Scripture? The Truth and Life Dramatized Audio Bible is the only Vatican-endorsed, fully dramatized New Testament available anywhere. It's got some great actors on it. I should know. I produced the CD set. I want you to sample this incredible scriptural experience. So I've posted the entire Gospel of Mark at RaymondArroyo.com as a free gift to you. You can listen to it online or download a free copy from the site. The bug is there in the middle of the homepage. And if you'd like to purchase the entire audio Bible, be my guest. Click the banner at the top of the site. And if you're planning a trip to D.C., why not experience the world over live in person? Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. Drop us an email at worldoverdc@yahoo.com, and we'll reserve a seat for you. When we return, we'll discuss the ongoing controversy surrounding sex abuse by clergy and the new translation of the New American Bible. Is this what Catholics want? Journalist and author Philip Lawler joins us when The World Over Live continues. You stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
When I first read about the disturbing news coming out of Philadelphia this week, I thought how similar this seemed to the situation in Boston. To help us sort through the details of this story, and to put it in context, we're joined by the founder of Catholic World News and the current director of CatholicCulture.org, Philip Lawler. He joins us via satellite from Massachusetts. Philip, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Phil, I want to start with the grand jury report came out about a month ago, and it suggested that there were 37 priests who were serious suspects in having committed sexual abuse. The diocese at the time, Cardinal Reilly, issued a statement, and he said, "I assure all the faithful there are no archdiocesan priests in the ministry today who have admitted or established allegation of sexual abuse of a minor against them." Why would he say such a thing and then only a few days later put three priests on administrative leave, and now this announcement this week with 21 men being put on administrative leave, suspended?
Why he would say it is a bit of a mystery to me. You mentioned that there's a similarity to Boston, but the great dissimilarity is this is 10 years later, and you'd think that people would have learned by now. If you look carefully at the Cardinal's statement, you'll notice that it's nuanced. He says that there were no admitted or established accusations. He didn't say that there were no credible accusations. And that's the distinction that broke down in the following days and forced him to take more definitive action because the public outcry was fairly deafening.
Yeah, in a lot of the reportage, it says the Cardinal was relying on the zero-tolerance policy accepted by the bishops and embraced by the Church a decade ago. But is that zero-tolerance policy, in your estimation, just, Phil, as we've seen it implemented in particular dioceses across the country?
No, I've been saying since Dallas and since the Dallas meeting in June 2002, I've been saying that the Dallas Charter does not do the job that it set out to do or that it should have set out to do. The Dallas Charter has zero tolerance, but it's enforced by the same people who were responsible for the decisions, the bad decisions that led to this problem before the Dallas Charter. So you have new policies, but the same people enforcing them. The problem before Dallas was not the policies. There were policies in place that would have guided bishops to make good decisions, to suspend priests who were credibly accused, to take priests out of ministry permanently if they were found guilty. Those policies were already there, and bishops had the power to do those things. Now, what we see exposed in Philadelphia is all these years, 9 years, not quite 10, after the Dallas policy has been put into place, we see there's a gaping credibility hole still because we have the prosecutor and the grand jury in Pennsylvania saying whatever policies were in place, they were not being carried out, and credible accusations were not being acted on. And now with the suspension of 24 out of the 36 priests mentioned in the grand jury report, you see that the Philadelphia Archdiocese has belatedly recognized that there is merit to the accusation.
Mm-hmm. If you have a question, give us a ring. 1-800-221-9460 is the number in the U.S. Internationally, 205-271-2980, or you can drop us an email, worldover@EWTN.com, and we will get to your calls and questions, so get them in now. Phil, I want to talk for a moment about the actions of Cardinal Reilly. After this explosive grand jury report was released to the public, he pretty soon thereafter brought in a former prosecutor to advise him and to go through the records and one by one determine if there were credible allegations here. Was that a good move?
That was a good move. It was an attempt to reestablish credibility. It was overdue, but it was necessary. And the outcome, as you see, with the removing these 21 priests after having already 3, so 24 in all, that was a result of this former prosecutor's recommendations. She looked through the files, and she found at least enough evidence to warrant looking further, which I thought was what the Dallas policy would have required of the Archdiocese as of 2002. So it appears that there was just a breakdown in enforcement of the bishop's own rules here.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is isolated, or that we are going to see more of these in the coming days across the country? Is this just one diocese that is negligent here?
That's a really good question, because I think a decade ago we were asking ourselves the same thing about Boston, saying, is this just one renegade archdiocese? And then, sadly, it proved to be far from the case, that there were many other places where the same sort of thing was happening. There's really no way to know. We know that the bishops have had an audit in place which audits whether they're following their own procedures. But again, the people who are providing the statistics for the audit, the people who are carrying out the procedures, are pretty much the same people who were responsible for bad decisions beforehand. So there's just really no way to know. I think it's a cinch to predict that there will be many more accusations along the same lines as the accusations made in Pennsylvania. And if there are other aggressive prosecutors, you might see other aggressive attempts to dig into the diocesan files and see if they really have carried out the policies that they say as they say they have.
Now, in some of these pieces and some of the reportage, Phil, it appears as if the diocese, in what is the largest suspension in American history, suspended 21 of these priests and released their names. Was that correct? Should that have happened?
I don't see how that's right, and this is another problem that I have with the Dallas policy. You have a zero-tolerance policy, and it requires the diocese or archdiocese to suspend a priest if there's any credible accusation. Now, in the nature of these things, very rarely are there witnesses or corroborating information. There's an accuser and there's an accused. And all you can really do is ask yourself, is the accusation plausible, before a priest is suspended and he will live under a cloud for the rest of his life. A lot of priests I know who have been suspended have had an awfully difficult time, if they have ever had an opportunity, clearing their own names, or even finding what it is they're accused of, even in some cases where the accusation seems to me very, very thin. So there are due process issues here that I wish would get more attention as well. I mean, really the fundamental problem that I have here is that the Dallas policy takes the heat off the bishops, and the heat should be on the bishops, particularly when we look at their track record prior to 2002, and also particularly if you look at it from the perspective of the Catholic community. These are the people in charge. It's their duty, and it's their charism to carry out that duty.
Now, I was with a group of priests the other day, and they were saying how difficult it is to fulfill the obligations of their ministry. They always feel they're looking over their shoulders because they're afraid that people who don't particularly like things they're preaching, or people who don't particularly care for their orthodoxy or their particular take on the church at this moment, might come up with these frivolous charges, and then he's out of the game. They simply sideline these men. And you and I both know priests who are at this moment in certain facilities and not active in their ministry due to false allegations. How do we stop this? What happens next? And do you think this case might indeed, the case of Philadelphia, might be part of opening that question up again?
I hope so. I hope it's part of opening up a lot of questions. I hope it's part of making people understand that shouting about accusations against priests, demanding the suspension and the laicization of every priest who's ever been accused, not convicted, accused. These are tactics that do not promote any kind of fairness, nor, by the way, do they help children be any safer. I mean, I've also become more and more frustrated with some of the victims groups that call for the laicization of every priest who is charged. Even if you change that to every priest who's convicted, if he's laicized, he's no longer under the control of the diocese, which means he's loose in the world. How does that protect children? I think that this has become a sort of lawyerly game, not a fun game at all. It's a destructive game, and it's not helping the church, it's not helping the victims, and it's not helping us to get to the bottom of really a very grievous scandal.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go to your calls, and we'll go to your emails in a moment. Many of you are writing in and calling about this. I also want to add another topic to the pyre here. Phil, this week the bishops released their New American Bible translation. I call it the New American Bible. And in it, they have changed some language here and there. It seems to me at times to comport with contemporary usage and to somehow placate certain special interest groups. Case in point, the word booty, which means treasure, has been changed to mean spoils of war in the New Bible. In Isaiah, the word virgin has been changed to young woman. Is this what the Catholic Church needs at this moment? This has been a 17-year-long project, but do we need a Bible that responds to every whim in the language and every permutation of English or its abuse?
Is that a trick question? I think the answer is no, we don't need that. If you look at the celebrations for the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, and you see how that language has stood the test of time, and yes, it is not the way we speak today. It's a different kind of language, but readers are intelligent enough to understand that. And some of these changes just absolutely baffle me because there are a lot of young women who have children. There aren't many virgins who have children. That seems to me an important distinction that Isaiah is making.
Yeah, well, there's another thing. In Proverbs 31:10, the ode, The Ideal Wife, now reads, the poem on the woman of worth. And a Bishops' Conference staffer, Mary Elizabeth Sperry, was quoted in USA Today saying, women will like this, being measured by their own accomplishments, not in terms of a husband's perspective. Does that concern you?
It does, because I'm a husband, and I have an ideal wife, and I can't read that passage without thinking of her. I mean, the Scripture speaks to all of us and speaks to us where we are. And I think that there's the manipulation, the micromanagement of the Word of God it's not a very fruitful pursuit.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go to an email here, Phil. This is Nicholas from Northeast Florida, and he writes, why is the Archbishop and the former Cardinal not being advised to resign? Why are they immune from any prosecution, yet Monsignor Lin has been named? Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the grand jury was looking into a time period for which Cardinal Reilly is not responsible. The grand jury report was very rough on Cardinal Bevilacqua and gave me the impression that were it not for the fact that he's elderly now, he might be facing charges himself. It should be a warning to other bishops out there. And one of the things that, Raymond, I've found somewhat encouraging about the reaction to this is the reaction of other bishops who have been quoted in the last few weeks as saying that what happened in Philadelphia looks wrong and some people should be held accountable. That's a terrific development. If we have one bishop calling another to accountability, that's something that we have not had in the last decade, and it would be one of the best things, one of the best new developments I could imagine.
Mm-hmm. Here's another email. It says, Phil, in your opinion, given the effectiveness of intervention of civil authorities with the Philadelphia Archdiocese, what has taken other civil authorities so long, especially in Boston? That's Anne from the Boston Archdiocese.
Civil authorities have been all over the Boston Archdiocese, and the Attorney General, Tom Reilly, back in the early years of this century, did his best to investigate, and he came away with a public announcement that he did not find enough evidence to warrant prosecution. There have been other dioceses where we have had more aggressive or more definitive prosecutors' reports in New Hampshire and Manchester, New Hampshire, and in Phoenix, where we had bishops who signed agreements stipulating that there was enough evidence to warrant prosecution. In Springfield, Massachusetts, we had a prosecutor who clearly said he would have prosecuted but for statute of limitations problems. Most frequently, that has been the sticking point for prosecutors, is the statute of limitations. And what's truly remarkable, again, about what happened in Philadelphia is that it happened after the eruption, or this grand jury's focus was on what has happened after the eruption of the scandal in 2000 to 2002.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I want to go to the phones. This is Lee from Pennsylvania. Go
Right.
ahead, Lee. You're in the Philly Archdiocese, right?
Right, exactly.
What's
we
your
had
comment?
a priest removed in our parish, okay, and I consider it for nonsensical reasons. The parish he was at before he came here, he's a kid's priest, okay? He's a big guy. He's like a jolly green giant, okay? He's a friendly, happy guy. And little girl ran over and grabbed him and I basically hugged him, I guess, but he bent over and gave her a kiss on the cheek, okay? And that's what he's being canned for.
Wow. Yeah, we don't know. Again, we don't know all the details, but just, Phil, as we've talked to other priests in other dioceses who have been pulled out of ministry for similar offenses or so-called offenses, what does this tell us? And do you think the bishops are at all responsive to the way that their clergy, at this point, looks upon them with suspicion and is really concerned about remaining in the priesthood? There's a deep concern, I think, on the part of a lot of priests.
There's an awful lot of concern among priests that, as you said earlier, they could be in trouble on the basis of an anonymous allegation, an allegation from someone who has a personal grudge. I had a priest tell me he wondered when he met his little nephew and gave him a hug whether that was a violation of the Dallas Charter. They're looking over their shoulders. It's really an unhealthy situation. And really, it would be so much better if people were looking at the bishops as fathers, as they should be, and if the priests were looking at them as their spiritual fathers and saying, I know he'll discipline me if I'm wrong, but I also know he'll protect me if I need protection. And that latter is lacking, sadly.
Unfortunately, the Dallas Charter, and you alluded to it earlier, it has created a distrust between the priest and the bishop because, as you said, all the heat is thrown on the priest the moment a charge is made. And it puts him at odds with the person whom he should be closest with in his moment of need and in a moment of crisis. If indeed he is guilty, he and the bishop should be in constant contact, not adversaries at that moment. They need to find a way forward. And it's a concern. Obviously, on the other side of the coin, Phil, as a father, and I'm sure you share the sentiment, if there's an offender and they're running around in parishes, they shouldn't be there. But that's not the fault necessarily of that priest. It's the fault of the person who's allowed him to be there or reassigned him after knowing of his crimes.
That's right. We've had the pendulum swing just wildly from one side to the other, from a situation where bishops were covering up evidence in effect, allowing these predatory priests to continue in ministry and to continue being predators, swinging all the way to the other where anyone who's accused, whether or not he's guilty, is in danger of losing his role in active ministry for the rest of his life. What we never had was a balanced, fatherly disciplinary approach. And, you know, what we're getting to here, I think, Raymond, is an important point that I have been trying to make for the past decade, is that this is not one scandal. It's at least two scandals. There's a scandal of a relatively small number of priests who have been doing despicable things. A relatively small number. It's still intolerably high, but it's a very small percentage of the priests who are out there. The second scandal, and I think hugely aggravating the first, is that we've had a scandal of bishops who were not doing their job in disciplining wayward priests and are still not doing their job in disciplining wayward priests, but expecting new procedures and these sort of draconian guidelines to take the responsibility out of their hands. And it won't work.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to the phones. Dan from Pennsylvania. Very quickly, Dan, what's your question or comment?
Good evening, Raymond and guests. I'd like to ask the question of what can be done, and is there anything being done about these people who do give false accusations against the priests? You know, is there anything that the diocese does after them? You know, should we be holding them accountable, you know, with their picture in the paper and the news, you know, to protect the good priests that we do have in our parishes, which there is many, you know, because you could just wipe out a priest just by, you know, these accusations.
Yep. Phil?
Again, I think that would be a fatherly thing to do in a sense too, and I have never heard of a case where the church authorities, chancery officials, went after someone for making a false accusation, and we know there are false accusations being made. It's profitable to try. There doesn't seem to be much of a risk, and that's wrong because it's almost creating an occasion of sin for people. We're giving them this temptation that the church is becoming a sort of corporate ATM machine. You make a charge and you collect your payment, and there's no risk to it at all. I think that the column makes a really good point. If we ask for prosecution or lawsuit against someone for false accusation, it would show a seriousness in the pursuit of truth, and it would show that we're going to require everyone to be held accountable, not just a few.
No, it's a really good point. Phil Lawler, thank you so much for being with us. We'll certainly keep track of this and be in touch with you.
Thank you again for having me, Raymond.
Phil's book, The Faithful Departed, The Collapse of Boston's Catholic Culture, is available everywhere. Up next, Robert Reilly joins us to talk about the crisis being felt within Islam, the closing of the Muslim mind, when the World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
My next guest is a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, and National Review. His latest book is The Closing of the Muslim Mind: How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis. As Congress considers the threat of Islamic radicalization here in the U.S., tonight's guest believes he knows what lies at the root of the current crisis within Islam. Please welcome to the program, Robert Reilly.
Raymond, thank
Robert,
you.
great to have you with us.
Wonderful to be here.
Now,
Thank
you have a background in government. You were director of Voice of America. You were a consultant to the Iraqi Minister of Information following the Iraqi war. What is your impression as you look at this situation we're seeing with these pockets? You heard our headlines earlier tonight. These explosive acts of violence coming, and they're not coming from nowhere. They're coming from a particular community. Is there something in Islam driving this? It surely isn't all Muslims, but it seems to be a pretty large group. What's driving this?
Well, unfortunately, Raymond, it's nothing new. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of my meeting with a Syrian Jesuit, Henri Boulad, who's worked for decades in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And he told me that every year there are 20,000 fewer Christians in Egypt. Many of them, let's say, forced conversions in the sense that the society discriminates against Christians and makes it so difficult for them. And that his opinion was that Christianity is disappearing from the Middle East entirely. Back in the 5th century, just the North African episcopacy consisted of 700 bishops.
Wow.
By the year 1070, we know that was down to 2 bishops because the remaining 2 bishops wrote to Pope Gregory saying, please send us a 3rd bishop so we can keep apostolic succession. Now, that gives you some idea of the scale of the extirpation of Christianity just in North Africa in that period, as the entire Middle East was mostly Christian when it was invaded by the Muslim Arabs in the 7th century.
Yeah. So, you know, as I look at so much of the reportage, as I listen to some of the hearings today, we'll play you little clips of that in a moment. The thing people often miss is you don't understand a religion without having respect or understanding of religion and an appreciation of history. You have both, and bring that to bear in your analysis. This is really, to my eye, a theological detective story, if you will, unpacking what happened in Islam, its evolution, and how we got where we are today. How did the Islamic mind, close, and when did it happen?
Yeah, that's a superb question, Raymond, because after 9/11, like most Americans, I was appalled and intrigued by some of the statements that Osama bin Laden made as to why he had done this. And in his television tape after 9/11, he quoted his spiritual mentor, Abdullah Azzam. And the quote was, "Terrorism is an obligation in Allah's religion." And I thought to myself, well, what kind of theology, what kind of idea of God would make terrorism mandatory in your religion? And then we had the great Regensburg lecture by Benedict the 16th, in which he goes back to that period and asks and says that using force in the spread of faith is unreasonable and therefore against God. And then he asks the question, however, if God is without reason, that very notion leads to that violence because there are no theological barriers to Abdullah Azzam's final statement that terrorism is an obligation in Allah's religion. Now, to locate within Islam the struggle over who God is, we would go to the 9th century when the influence of Greek philosophy on Islam was as great as it was in earlier periods in Christianity.
Wow.
And Muslims at that time were assimilating their Aristotle and their Plato, and they were asking, well, what is the relationship between reason and God and this Quran that we have? And the first fully developed theological school said the relationship is God's reason, our reason, and the reasoned order of creation. And this is what we have been given. We can come to know right and wrong. We're free to choose, and we'll be held accountable for it. Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
Well, because it's the product of the same influences under which Christianity had come. And indeed, those influences seeped through Christianity to Islam at that time. A reaction set in against this school of theology.
In the 9th century.
In the 9th century, in which they denied every one of those points. God is not reason, he's pure will and power. Your reason is incapable of knowing him or of knowing the difference between right and wrong. You can only know that through revelation.
The Quran.
The Quran and the Hadith, which are the sayings and doings of Muhammad. So reality, creation, has no nature to it. It's simply the instantaneous product of God's will, and it therefore becomes unintelligible to you because God is not reason producing this. He's just pure will and power.
This is the strain of theology then that is embraced in the Sunni world.
Unfortunately, this theological school triumphed because 3 caliphs after the one who sponsored the rational theological school embraced their opponents and enforced these teachings the denial of free will, that the Quran has existed co-eternally with God, the predestination, and these other things that have afflicted the Muslim world and turned it into such a highly dysfunctional place.
So it's a concept of God as pure will. And the Quran, explain this to, there's a lot of people I think have no concept of this. They think, oh, well, Muslims think of the Quran the way we think of the Bible. It's the Word of God. Here it is. We put it on the shelf. It's there. That's not exactly the understanding.
No, it's not at all. In almost the entire Islamic world, the Quran is considered an eternal document that has existed forever with God on a tablet in heaven, just as it exists today in Arabic. Arabic is the language of God, and that is why anyone who converts to Islam gets an Arabic name, has to memorize their prayers in Arabic, even though they don't understand what these prayers say. It is not the Holy Spirit working through Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, in which you could say, well, did John write this? Because that's not his style. There's no such question with the Quran. It's the direct dictation of God through Gabriel to Muhammad in his exact words. So as a German theologian put it, in Christianity you have the incarnation in Christ. In Islam you have the in-liberation. It's the divine book. So that's the status of the Quran in Islam is comparable to the status of Christ in Christianity.
Himself.
Exactly.
Now, how does this relate? This one understands this how this closing of the Islamic mind took place, and the basic thesis is it was de-Hellenized. I think that's what Pope Benedict said in the Regensburg
That's
address,
exactly right. In the Regensburg address, he said that the problem with Islam is it was de-Hellenized, that it rejected what he called reason, the gift of the Greeks, philosophy. And that if there's to be a dialogue between the Christian world and the Islamic world, it needs to be re-Hellenized. You know, there's a great episode.
Well, how do you do that? How do you re-Hellenize?
Let me just tell you that Thomas Aquinas was approached by his fellow Dominicans who said, how are we supposed to deal with these Muslims? And Thomas said, well, you can't deal with them from our scripture because they don't accept it. And we can't deal with them from their scripture because we don't accept it. Therefore, you must treat them as natural men, by which he meant through their reason. Now, the problem is, within Islam, reason has been denigrated to the point in which it has no status from which to engage in a dialogue. Reason is not a reliable way in which to come to know right and wrong
or truth.
Good or truth. Truth is simply known only through that revelation.
So let's connect that. I want to get back to the question in a moment about what we do, but let's connect that understanding to what we're seeing playing out in the headlines. In Arizona, a father convicted just a few weeks ago. He ran his daughter over. She was living with a boyfriend. So he got in his Jeep and he ran her over a few times, killed her. You have a TV executive in Buffalo. The wife presents him with divorce papers. He beheads her. These are honor killings. How does that tie in? Where does, I guess, reason has been totally short-circuited at that point?
Well, you have to remember that morality then becomes a product only of Islamic law. There's no way to think outside of that Islamic law. There's a principle in Islamic jurisprudence that says reason is not a legislator. Reason is not a legislator. That's why they don't have legislatures, because reason doesn't have the status to legislate.
So democracy is entirely anathema to this.
Well, if you follow through the theology of this school that is the predominant school in Sunni Islam, there is no theological foundation for it. There's this one wonderful Iranian theologian, Abdul Karim Soroush, said, if you want a democracy, you need a different idea of God. So there you are. It has to be, what you need is logos. God is logos. God as the word, God as reason. Now, just to get to your point, there are several influences in these incidents. Some of them are tribal, that are pre-Islamic from Arabia. And then there are the penalties spelt out in the Quran and the Sharia for this kind of infidelity. As you probably know, men can have 4 wives and unlimited concubines.
Oh, yeah, pleasure wife, temporary
but
wife.
Sex outside of marriage is dealt with very harshly, particularly on the part of the woman, who can be stoned or flogged. And the honor side comes from the tribal background, that the integrity of your tribe depends on the virginity of your women. And if that is violated, the woman is useless. She's to be disposed of, and that's the background for that pathological view, I'm afraid.
Yikers. I want to share with people, Peter King, a congressman on Capitol Hill from New York, held hearings today. These have been very controversial hearings, and he's looking into homegrown terrorism, jihadist radicalism taking root here in the United States. This is a little clip of Judy Jasser. He is of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. This is a little bit of his testimony. Listen to this.
What I hope that we can discuss is get beyond this blind concept of violent extremism. It is a final step, but radicalization is a continuum. Cooperation is a continuum. I've personally never known a Muslim that wouldn't report somebody about to blow something up or commit an act of violence. But that's a final step on a continuum of radicalization.
Robert Reilly, react to that for me. He said he's never known a Muslim who wouldn't report somebody about to blow something up or commit an act of violence. Is there a religious imperative to report a fellow Muslim who might be engaged in that sort of jihad?
No, there's a religious imperative from the Quran not to do it. You would never report.
Not to do it.
Yes, you would never report on a fellow Muslim to a non-Muslim. So the force of revelation is exactly against that. This doctor from Arizona, who is a Navy veteran, is an outstanding example of the American Muslim community, who is very concerned about fighting the radicalization that can take place in some of these mosques and in some of these schools. So he's a model in my own.
Yeah, but I wonder why he said that comment was interesting, I thought, from him. And, it raised eyebrows, I know, in the room when he was
Well, I think the Muslims he knows would turn
probably,
someone in. The
exactly.
Muslims I know and have worked with over the years and with whom I went to Iraq are outstanding Americans who are fighting for the exact same things.
But clearly, when you get something like the Fort Hood disaster, or you see what's happening in Germany, where they were shot up a bus full of Air Force men, something's going on here.
And that's exactly what Congressman King is trying to look at here. I mean, there's a violent ideology behind this kind of behavior, and it's being inculcated and instilled in young people, and that's what we need to address.
Isn't the danger, though, and some have raised this concern about Pete King, that you're targeting a single religious group, Bob, and therefore subjecting them to a type of bigotry by calling the entire group out for the isolated acts of members of that group?
You mean talking about the problem is what creates it?
Having a hearing about it on Capitol Hill.
Well, I remember hearing a representative of CARE saying that 9/11 had nothing to do with Islam, which would lead one to ask whether they were Eskimos. I mean, what do you mean it had nothing to do? It was done explicitly in the name of Islam. It was an act that was repellent to many Muslims, and it was certainly repellent to most American Muslims. But nonetheless, it is a feature of that faith that was utilized to justify it.
I want to go to a Dr. Shaker who joins us from New Jersey. Very quickly, Doctor, you have a comment.
Well, I have a comment. I'm really very surprised about the United States government that been always talking about democracy and the human rights, but when it comes to the Christians of the Middle East, they are the one who really don't support any Christian in the Middle East, in contrast to what I have seen them supporting the Muslims in Bosnia during the time of Clinton, and they went to all these NATO troops to save the Muslims over there. I don't see them taking similar position, or at least less than that, toward the Christians who are being killed in Egypt, being killed in Iraq, and everywhere in the Middle East. On the contrary, they are the ones who are supporting all these radical Muslim groups. They are the ones who created Taliban. They are the ones who are willing to put hand in hand with the Muslim Brotherhood, like Mrs. Clinton last week was saying, we don't mind that the Muslim Brotherhood take over the government of Egypt, who will welcome them. So what the position exactly of the United States? They care for the human rights, or only they care for the political and economical rights?
Okay, Doctor.
And
now
using democracy as a star for that.
And you're a Coptic Christian who fled Egypt.
I'm a Coptic Christian.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing the United States should be doing are helping the people in the Muslim world whose side we wish to see win. who are attempting to fight against the radicals who are persecuting the Christians, the ones who are attacking the Christians, as opposed to the Muslims whom I have worked with, who are the ones who surround the Christian churches to prevent the Islamists from destroying them or murdering more Christians. The least we could do is help them. And I'm afraid in our public diplomacy and foreign policy, we have fallen very short of that, as you have said.
Well, I think we've fallen way short. This is a genocide, Bob. When you see the last Christian, this is the cradle of Christianity, and these communities are being obliterated by what is nothing short of a jihad against the adherents of Christianity. I don't see how we as a nation and all the nations of Europe and all of our allies don't see the crisis that is befalling us. When you have 5,000 Christians running off to the Nineveh plains, fleeing their homeland where they've been for centuries because they fear they're going to get blown up or somebody's going to shoot them in the alley, something is really, really wrong there. And you touch upon it in the book. What can we do? How do you engage? If we accept your thesis, where do we go from here?
The problem stems from a deformed idea of God. It's a theological problem, and it has to be addressed at a theological level. Just as the Pope said in the Regensburg lecture, if God is without reason, that is ultimately the source of violence when this force is used against another faith. There was no word for conscience in Arabic. So when you wonder why there's no freedom of conscience within that culture, go back and examine that. The majority of Egyptians today, something like more than 80%, support the death penalty for anyone who converts from Islam. Mm-hmm. So the problem is theological, has to be addressed at the theological
and you say
level.
in the book, this is really in the final analysis, it's ideology parading as religion, masquerading as religion.
In the aspect it has taken on amongst these Islamists, it has combined the worst of Western totalitarianism with the worst of what Islam has ever produced.
Yeah, and we're not talking about all Muslims. We're talking about these radical jihadists.
But just as we weren't talking about all the peoples in the Russian Empire in 1917, but only a radical group of Marxist-Leninists, they took over that empire, and the same danger exists within the Muslim world today.
Okay. Robert Reilly, thanks for being here.
Thank you,
the
Raymond.
book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis, is available in paperback at bookstores everywhere. And you can follow Robert's work at the American Foreign Policy Council by going to afpc.org. Until next week, you can find updates and the occasional commentary by following me on Twitter or on my Facebook fan page. Just go to RaymondArroyo.com and you can click through from there. You can also sign up for my e-blast and get the free, fully dramatized Gospel of Mark from the Truth and Life audio Bible at RaymondArroyo.com. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. Bye now.